In Paris, Europe's most powerful leaders gather to defend borders, law, and sovereignty. They speak of Ukraine, they speak of Russia, they speak of war and peace. But the most dangerous question in the room is never spoken. What if the country threatening Europe's sovereignty is its closest ally? I'm Fareed Zakaria, and today Greenland forces us to confront a reality many in Europe are desperate to ignore. While NATO struggles to protect Ukraine from Russian aggression, the President of the United States publicly declares that America needs Greenland, not through partnership, not through diplomacy, but through control. This is not rhetoric. This is power speaking plainly. Greenland is no longer just ice and geography. It has become a test of NATO's credibility, of Europe's courage, and of a world order built on rules rather than force. If you want to understand where global power truly resides today, stay with me, because to grasp why this moment terrifies Europe, we must step back. To understand why Greenland has become so explosive, we need to be precise about the problem Europe is facing. This is not simply a dispute over territory. It is a collision between two ideas of power. On one side is the world Europe believes in, where sovereignty is protected by alliances, rules, and collective restraint. On the other is a world Donald Trump openly describes, where security is defined by control, leverage, and raw national interest. In Paris, European leaders were trying to keep the United States committed to Ukraine. They knew that American support is indispensable, and they feared that pushing back too hard on Greenland could put that support at risk. So they attempted an impossible balancing act: defend Denmark's sovereignty without provoking Washington, affirm NATO unity while avoiding a direct challenge to its dominant member. This is the core dilemma. Europe is being forced to choose between principles and protection, and it is not clear it can have both. To see how Europe ended up this vulnerable, we need to look at how this system was built. To understand how Europe arrived at this moment, we have to return to the architecture of the post-Cold War world. For decades, Europe made a strategic choice. It outsourced hard power to the United States and invested instead in integration, trade, and law. NATO became the ultimate insurance policy. American military dominance was the silent guarantee behind European stability. Greenland sits squarely inside that history. During the Cold War, the United States built a major military base on the island. At its peak, tens of thousands of American personnel were stationed there. When the Cold War ended, that presence quietly shrank. Attention drifted elsewhere. At the same time, Europe internalized a belief that alliances were permanent and that sovereignty within NATO was never in question. Conflict was assumed to come from outside the system, not from within it. That assumption now looks fragile. As great power competition returned in the Arctic, in Ukraine, in global politics, Europe discovered that it had lost not only capabilities, but leverage, and that vulnerability would soon be exposed. The tension finally broke when the words became impossible to ignore. Donald Trump did not speak in hypotheticals. He spoke in certainties. Greenland, he said, was so strategic right now, covered with Russian and Chinese ships, too important to be left in Danish hands, and with that, a red line was crossed. For European leaders, this was no longer an abstract concern. This was a sitting American president openly questioning the ability and the right of a NATO ally to control its own territory. Denmark pushed back. It pledged billions in new defense spending. It pointed out that the United States already has a military base on the island. But facts were no longer the point. The message was power. In Paris, the silence was deafening. No confrontation. No unified response. If this moment unsettled you, it should, because when a crisis exposes fear rather than resolve, it tells us something fundamental about the system itself. And to understand why this threat carries such weight, we need to look beneath the surface. Beneath the headlines and the statements lies a quieter, more uncomfortable mechanism. This crisis is not really about Greenland. It is about dependence, Europe's security system was built on an assumption of American restraint, that Washington would always act as the ultimate guarantor, not as a rival within the alliance. As long as that assumption held, Europe could afford unity without power, but power asymmetry changes behavior. The United States dominates NATO's intelligence, command structures, air capabilities, and strategic reach. Europe knows this, and Washington knows, Europe knows it. That imbalance creates silence. It turns allies into cautious managers of American moods rather than equal partners in strategy. So when Trump speaks of Greenland, Europe hesitates, not because it doubts Denmark's sovereignty, but because it fears the cost of defiance. This is the hidden mechanism at work. Dependence limits choice, and when choice disappears, principles quietly erode. What looks like diplomacy is often anxiety in formal dress. And that anxiety is about to surface again more sharply, more publicly. The second rupture came not from words, but from precedent. Just days earlier, the United States had acted decisively in Venezuela, unilaterally, militarily, without alliance consensus. For European officials watching closely, the message was unmistakable. Washington was willing to move first and explain later. That changed the Greenland question overnight. What had once sounded like bluster now carried weight. If sovereignty could be overridden in one place, it could be challenged in another, especially when the power imbalance is this extreme. Behind closed doors, anxiety replaced analysis. Could NATO even function if one ally threatened another? What would Article 5 mean in such a scenario? No one had clear answers, because the alliance was never designed for this. Publicly, leaders urged calm. Privately, they began to confront an unthinkable possibility that deterrence might not apply inside the alliance itself. This was no longer a theoretical debate. It was a countdown, and the people who would feel the consequences first were not diplomats or generals. They were ordinary citizens. Now, let's bring this down to where it really lands with you, because when alliances fracture, it is not treaties that feel the shock first. It is ordinary lives. If you live in Denmark, this is not abstract strategy. It is the sudden realization that sovereignty may depend not on law, but on the mood of a stronger friend. That promises written on paper may bend under pressure. If you live elsewhere in Europe, the message is just as unsettling. Your security, your borders, your peace, all rest on an alliance where power is uneven and voices are not equal. You are told this system keeps you safe. But safety built on dependence is fragile. This is why the silence matters. This is why hesitation matters. If this moment leaves you uneasy, you are not wrong to feel that way. Pay attention to that discomfort, because it is telling you something important about the world you are living in and the one that may be coming. And once you feel that shift at home, you begin to see how far its ripples travel. Once you widen the lens, the Greenland crisis stops being a European problem. It becomes a global signal. Allies around the world are watching closely. If sovereignty can be questioned inside NATO, what does that say to partners in Asia, in the Middle East, in the global South? The message is unsettlingly simple. Rules matter until power decides otherwise. In the Arctic, this matters enormously. The region is no longer remote or frozen in geopolitics. It is a new frontier of competition, where Russia and China are already testing limits. If Europe cannot clearly defend one of its own, it weakens the idea of collective security everywhere. Deterrence depends not just on weapons, but on credibility. And credibility erodes quietly, then suddenly. This is how influence shifts. Not through invasion, but through hesitation. Not through conquest, but through doubt. What happens in Greenland will echo far beyond the ice, because global order is not enforced by statements, it is enforced by resolve. And that raises the hardest question of all. What happens next? From this point forward, the future branches into three paths: The first is the optimistic scenario. Europe closes ranks. It speaks with one voice. It reduces its dependence on the United States by investing seriously in its own defense and strategic autonomy. Greenland becomes a catalyst not for division, but for renewal. The second path is muddling through. Europe avoids confrontation. Washington moderates its tone, but not its leverage. The alliance survives, but weakened, governed more by habit than trust. Sovereignty remains intact for now, but uncertainty becomes permanent. The third path is the darkest. The United States pushes further. Europe hesitates again. And the idea that alliances protect the weak from the strong quietly collapses, not with a bang, but with a shrug. History tells us that systems rarely fall because of one dramatic event. They erode when assumptions no longer hold. Greenland is not the cause of this moment. It is the warning, and how Europe responds will determine whether this is a turning point or a footnote. All of this brings us to the final question. Moments like this rarely announce themselves as historic. They arrive quietly, through hesitation, through silence. Greenland forces us to confront a simple, unsettling truth. Alliances do not fail when enemies attack. They fail when power inside them goes unchecked. For decades, Europe believed that rules had replaced force. That law had tamed power. That history had moved on. But history never leaves. It waits. What happens now will not be decided in speeches or communiques. It will be decided by whether Europe chooses comfort or consequence, whether it accepts dependence or demands agency. No one is asking Europe to fight the United States. But the real question is harder than that. Is Europe willing to defend the idea that sovereignty still matters even when it is inconvenient? Because if that idea collapses here, it collapses everywhere. If this conversation made you uneasy, that's a sign you're paying attention. Stay with me. Share this. Question it. The future of global order will not be shaped by certainty, but by how we respond to moments like this. And this is only the beginning.